The morning sun had barely broken through the fog when Jack Monroe arrived at Willow Pines Senior Living Center. It was a modest brick building tucked behind a row of old oak trees, their branches still bare in early spring. The iron gates creaked softly behind him as he stepped onto the path lined with daffodils and silence. Day 3. 3 days into the strange promise he'd made to himself, 100 jobs in 100 days. Not for money, not for fame, just a desperate attempt to reclaim something he couldn't name. Some days, he told himself it was about reconnecting with life. Other days, it was just about not breaking down. The woman at the front desk gave him a clipboard and a hairnet. "Today, you're helping out with basic care," she said, giving him a once-over. "You'll be assisting residents with their meals, walks, and general needs. It's not glamorous, but it's important." Jack nodded. "I've cleaned latrines in the desert. I think I can handle mashed potatoes and diapers." But he quickly realized this was a different kind of battlefield. By mid-morning, he was already sore. Lifting elderly residents into wheelchairs was no joke, especially when your lower back still flinched from a roadside explosion 12 years ago. He moved carefully, gently, reminding himself these were someone's mothers and fathers. He helped Ms. Thompson brush her hair even though she called him Gerald the whole time. He guided Mr. Ramos down the hallway at a glacial pace while the old man muttered angrily about breakfast being late. But it wasn't just the physical work that wore him down. It was the silence. The hallways were quiet in a strange way. Not peaceful but heavy. The kind of quiet that followed grief and waiting. By lunchtime, Jack was exhausted. He sat in the staff lounge with a paper cup of coffee when the head nurse poked her head in. "You free for one more task?" Jack didn't answer right away. "Sure," he said finally. "There's a resident." She continued. "George Whitaker. 92. He doesn't talk much. Not anymore. You don't have to do anything fancy. Just sit with him for a bit. Maybe get him to eat." Jack raised an eyebrow. "That's it." She smiled, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Respect or warning. Maybe both. He served. World War II. Battle of the Bulge. Used to tell stories all the time, but now he mostly stares out the window. People think he's shut down. I think he's just waiting for someone worth talking to. Jack felt a small jolt in his chest. One soldier visiting another. "Room 214, she said, already turning away. He stood outside the door for a few moments before knocking softly and entering. The room was dimly lit. A small lamp glowed beside a bed with rumpled sheets. There was a bookshelf with more dust than books, and a framed photograph of a young man in uniform next to a woman with bright eyes. And there he was, George Whitaker, sitting in a wheelchair by the window, head turned slightly, watching the wind rustle the trees outside. Jack cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitaker? I'm Jack. I'm just here to hang out for a while. Maybe keep you company." No answer. Jack moved slowly, pulling a chair beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking of a wall clock and the soft hum of life outside the window. Jack took off his cap and set it in his lap. "I was in the army too, Sergeant. Afghanistan. 2007. Still nothing. Not even a glance." Jack looked out the window, matching George's gaze. "They used to say the sand could melt the soul out there," he said quietly. "But sometimes, I miss it. Not the war, just knowing who I was." The silence that followed was different. Not dismissive, just listening. And in that silence, something shifted. Jack didn't push. He didn't prod. He just sat there, shoulder to shoulder with a man who had fought a war the world remembered, and carried a silence the world had forgotten. He didn't know yet that this afternoon would change the way he saw the past, or how deeply it could heal. But he felt it. Something old and buried had stirred in both of them. And the next chapter hadn't even begun. The second time Jack came to George Whitaker's room, he brought tea. Not from the cafeteria, but his own. He had a stash of Earl Grey in his backpack, a habit from deployment days when familiarity meant sanity. He boiled water in the breakroom kettle and poured it into 2 mismatched ceramic mugs. One read "World's Best Grandpa," chipped along the handle. George was in the same place as yesterday, motionless in his wheelchair, staring out at the courtyard. "Figured I'd come back," Jack said, placing one cup on the side table beside George, keeping the other for himself. "Hope you don't mind caffeine after lunch." The old man didn't move, but his eyes, Jack noticed, flickered toward the cup. That was enough. Jack sat down, sipped quietly, and looked out the window with him. It was gray today, sky like wet concrete, trees shifting like ghosts. "I used to drink this stuff in the green zone," Jack said after a while. "Middle of the night, third watch. You'd be amazed how many moments in war smell like oversteeped tea." Silence, but not cold. Felt expectant. Jack leaned back in his chair. "You know," he began again, "in my unit they said if a guy starts telling war stories without being asked, he's full of it. But if a guy won't tell you a thing, he's seen too much." George turned his head, just slightly. Then, in a voice that sounded like gravel and wind, he spoke for the first time. "You ever seen trees explode?" Jack blinked. "Not trees, no. Ardennes. Winter of '44. George rasped. "German 88s didn't need to hit you. They'd hit the trees above us. Shrapnel rained down like iron hail." He paused, his eyes cloudy, distant. "I was 21. Thought I was invincible. Then Private Harmon took a splinter the size of a spoon through his neck. Just like that, we dragged his body to a foxhole and kept shooting." Jack didn't interrupt, didn't nod, just held the silence steady, giving the man room. "That's where I lost my hearing, mostly. Artillery. Weeks of it. After that, it was like the world got muffled. Suited me fine." George reached out, slow, deliberate, and picked up the teacup. His hands trembled, but he managed a sip. "Not bad," he muttered. Jack chuckled. "I won't tell the kitchen." They sat like that for another half hour. George didn't launch into a monologue. This wasn't a Hollywood confession. But slowly, in pieces like puzzle tiles falling into place, he shared moments. Crossing the Rhine under cover of darkness. A German soldier who surrendered by handing George a chocolate bar and crying. Letters from home that arrived weeks too late. "Emily," George murmured once, eyes soft. "She was French. Helped at a field hospital in Normandy. We danced once. In a church missing half its roof." Jack felt something tighten in his chest. "And then?" he asked gently. George just shook his head. "War ends. You leave the living behind with the dead." Jack said nothing, but inside, something clicked. That line, it wasn't just about George's past. It was about his too. So many faces, buried in sand and time. So many names no one else remembered. The next day, Jack brought a checkerboard. "I figured," he said, placing it on the tray between them, "we could either play or just yell at it together. Your call." George smirked, actually smirked, and moved a red piece forward. As they played, more stories surfaced. Not grand, sweeping tales, but small, aching truths. The day George lost his best friend to a sniper in Bastogne. The bottle of whiskey they passed around when they heard about the German surrender. The time he didn't shoot a fleeing soldier, and still wondered why. Jack didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until George asked him a question. "You said Afghanistan?" Jack nodded, adjusting a black piece on the board. "Twice. 2007 and again in 2010. Infantry." George looked at him hard. "You see any friends die?" Jack hesitated. "Yes. Too many. Just enough to keep me from sleeping some nights," Jack admitted. George leaned back in his chair. "Then you know what it means when a memory walks in before you do." They didn't play much after that. They didn't need to. The checkerboard became just something to fill the space between truths. By Friday, Jack noticed something strange. He didn't dread walking into Willow Pines anymore. He still got sore, still dealt with confused residents and the occasional accident. But there was a rhythm now, a strange sense of peace. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And every afternoon, he'd bring a different type of tea. Green, mint, chamomile. George tried them all. then declared they were all fancy water and demanded Earl Grey again. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. One afternoon, as they watched squirrels wrestle in the courtyard, George spoke up. "You know the worst part?" he asked, eyes never leaving the glass. "What?" "It's not the gunshots or blood. It's that everyone assumes you're fine because you made it home." Jack nodded slowly. "Coming back doesn't mean coming back whole," he said. George chuckled darkly. "Amen to that." Jack glanced at the old man beside him. This worn-out body, still sharp in flashes, still grieving, still remembering. And he realized something. This job, this day, wasn't just about caring for the elderly. It was about bearing witness. About telling the world he was here. He mattered. His story counts. Tomorrow would come. New job, new place. But today, Jack had earned something few ever do. The trust of a man who had survived hell, and still found it in himself to sip tea with a stranger. Jack had thought war stories were the hardest things to hear. He was wrong. The hardest were the silences between them. Those moments when George paused mid-sentence, eyes unfocused, like the past had reached out and grabbed him by the throat. It was during one of those silences, on a rainy Wednesday, that George whispered something that stopped Jack cold. "You ever wake up thinking you're still there?" George asked. "Like the war didn't end? Just got quieter?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. His hands, clenched tightly in his lap, said it all. George gave a short, bitter laugh. "Some nights I hear them. The men. The boots in snow. Harmon calling my name even though I buried him myself. I hear Emily too. Always in French. Always out of reach." It was the first time he'd mentioned her name again since the checkerboard game. Jack leaned forward, voice low. "You ever talk to anyone about it? Your family?" George's expression turned stone. "Wife passed 10 years ago. Kids call at Christmas mostly out of guilt. They think I'm just a forgetful old man. They don't want to hear about dead friends or guilt that sticks like tar." A long pause. "Truth is, I never told anyone everything. Not even my wife. What would be the point? Civilians don't understand ghosts." Jack looked down. His own ghosts didn't have names. They had call signs, blood types, and final screams. "I do," he said softly. "I understand." George's eyes locked onto his. It was the first time he truly saw Jack. Not just as a caregiver but as a soldier. "You got out?" George asked. Jack hesitated. "Honorably discharged. Shrapnel to the knee. Could have stayed, but my fire was gone." George nodded like he already knew. "You can leave the battlefield," he said. "But if you don't unpack your soul, you're still living in it." Jack let those words settle in the quiet room, where the only sound was the rain tapping at the glass. Later that afternoon, George did something unexpected. He opened the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out an old, yellowed envelope. The paper was thin, almost brittle, sealed with a faded wax crest. "I want to show you something," George said, handing it to Jack. "But don't open it yet." Jack turned it over carefully. On the front, written in neat cursive, "To Emily in case I never return." By the time Jack returned home that evening, the rain had stopped, but his thoughts still felt like storm clouds. He placed the envelope gently on the table and booted up his laptop. He didn't know what he was expecting. A miracle, a headline, a Facebook post, but something inside him wouldn't allow him to let go. He started with what little he had. Name, Emily. Location, Normandy, France. Year, 1944. He typed slowly, cross-referencing the name Emily Levesque with French wartime medical personnel. A few blurry photos. A scanned roster. Nothing concrete. Then he found it. A digital archive from the Kin War Heritage Museum, listing the names of volunteer nurses who had served during and after the D-Day landings. One name stood out. Emily Levesque, 1921 to 2009. Born in Bayeux, served as a field nurse with the Free French Forces. Jack's stomach twisted. Not because she had passed, but because he had found her. She was real. Scrolling further, He discovered that Emily had never married, though she had lived with her sister's family after the war. She'd worked at a school clinic for nearly 30 years and passed away peacefully at age 88. In the comments section beneath her obituary, someone had written, "She never had children, but she was a mother to so many of us." Jack sat back in silence. She was gone, but her story hadn't disappeared. And maybe, just maybe, someone from her family was still around to hear what George had never dared to say. The next morning, Jack walked into Willow Pines with a different kind of energy. The envelope was safely tucked in his jacket pocket, sealed, untouched, exactly as George had handed it to him. He went straight to room 214. George was awake, though his face looked pale, thinner than just a day before. He smiled faintly when he saw Jack. "You look like a man on a mission," George croaked. "I found her," Jack said quietly. "Emily passed away in 2009, but she lived a full life, helped people, never married." George's eyes glistened. His lips parted slightly, as if words were trying to form but couldn't make the journey. "I also found her niece. She still lives in Bayou, teaches history. She helps run the war museum there." Jack held up the envelope. "I'd like to send this to her." George nodded almost imperceptibly. "Do it," he whispered. Jack sat beside him and carefully unsealed the envelope. He didn't read it, he wouldn't. Some things weren't meant for anyone else. Instead, he added a short note of his own, explaining who George was, what he had carried, and why this letter had waited 78 years to find its way home. The letter went out that afternoon via Express International Courier. Jack paid for it himself. He didn't tell the nurses or the other residents. This wasn't their story to share. It was George's and Emily's. For the next 2 days, Jack visited George every afternoon. The old man barely spoke now, but he smiled when Jack entered the room, and that was enough. On the 4th morning, Jack arrived early. Room 214 was empty. The bed was made. The chair by the window sat untouched. And on the nightstand, laid out with reverence, was George's Bronze Star Medal, his army photo, and a folded American flag. A nurse touched Jack's shoulder gently. "He passed just before sunrise," she said. Peacefully. Jack didn't cry. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at the window where George had watched the world in silence for so many years. That evening, Jack received an email. It was from Marianne Levesque, Emily's niece. "Dear Jack, I received the letter this morning. I'm writing through tears. I remember my aunt speaking about a kind American soldier named George. She kept a photograph of him tucked inside her copy of Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. She told me once, 'There are loves that only exist for a few weeks, but last forever in memory.' Thank you for delivering this letter. Thank you for honoring her. And him. If I ever visit the States, I hope to leave flowers for George. With deep gratitude, Marianne." Jack stared at the screen for a long time. Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the silence wash over him. Not the silence of trauma or ghosts, but the silence of something finally finding its place. Closure. His breath caught. "You wrote this during the war?" Jack asked. George nodded. "Right before we pulled out of Normandy. She was a nurse, kept us alive with barely anything. I fell for her hard. We were kids, really." He swallowed hard. "I was going to give her that letter the night we left, but I panicked. Told myself she'd forget me anyway. I carried it through Germany, Belgium, home. Then I put it in that drawer and tried to forget I ever wrote it." Jack ran his fingers over the envelope, feeling the age, the weight of it. "Why are you showing me this now?" he asked. George looked at him, voice suddenly fragile. "Because I'm tired, Jack. And if I die before this letter gets where it belongs, then it's like none of it ever mattered. Like I never loved her, never fought, never came back." Jack's jaw clenched. "You want me to find her?" George exhaled. "If she's alive, or if someone in her family is. If not, burn it. I just want to know I tried. One last time." Jack nodded solemnly. "I'll do it, I swear." George leaned back in his chair, his whole body sinking like a deflated tent. For the first time, Jack noticed how small the man looked, how time had carved him down to memory and will. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay on the couch in his rented studio apartment, staring at the ceiling fan spinning shadows across the room. The envelope sat on the table beside him, untouched. He'd faced ambushes, IEDs, and sniper fire, but this felt harder. This was a mission of the heart, not muscle. He imagined Emily as a young woman, smiling, wiping sweat from her brow in a bombed-out hospital. He imagined George, barely more than a boy, handing her a flower he'd snuck from a German garden. Jack reached for his phone and typed Emily Levesque plus Normandy plus World War II into a search engine. Tens of results. Too many. Too old. But one name popped up. A local museum in Cannes had a photo archive and a staff directory. He bookmarked it. Maybe it was foolish. But after everything George had told him, letting the story end in a nightstand drawer felt like betrayal. When Jack returned to Willow Pines the next morning, George was asleep. The nurse at the desk said he'd had a rough night. Vitals were okay, but his breathing had been shallow. Jack stood at the doorway for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of the blanket over George's chest. He pulled the envelope from his jacket pocket and stared at it again. How many soldiers had written letters like this? How many had died with them unopened? But this one might still have a chance. He placed the envelope back in his jacket. He didn't know if Emily was alive, but he owed it to George, and to all the ghosts that walked alongside them both, to try. The memorial service was small, modest, quiet, just like George would have wanted. No grand speeches, no choirs, no military parade. Just a few staff members from Willow Pines, one or two residents who could still walk the halls, and Jack Monroe, standing at the back of the common room with his hands clasped tightly behind him. A photograph of George Whittaker, taken during his younger days in uniform, sat on a table beside a folded flag and a small display case with his Bronze Star and Combat Infantry badge. His army boots, weathered and brown, rested at the base of the frame, laces tied. The facility director spoke briefly. A nurse recited a short psalm. But when they asked if anyone wanted to say a few words, the room turned still. All eyes eventually found Jack. He stepped forward. His palms were sweating, his throat dry, but he cleared his voice and began. I didn't know George long, just a handful of days, really. But in those days, I learned more about war, love, loss, and memory than I did in my own deployment overseas. He paused, searching the room. George wasn't just a veteran. He was a living time capsule, carrying pieces of a history we too often forget. Not just battles and medals, but the people, the moments that made life worth surviving. Jack looked down at the folded flag. He once told me that coming home doesn't mean coming back whole. And he was right. But I think George found something close to peace in these final days. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photocopy of Marion Levesque's email. Because of a letter he wrote 78 years ago, because of a love he never stopped carrying, we were able to reconnect two souls across time. Emily remembered him, and now, thanks to him, we remember them both. Jack stepped back, nodding gently, and the room fell into a reverent hush. A staff member pressed play on a speaker. The soft strains of taps filled the air. Haunting and beautiful, Jack stood at attention. And though his body still bore the aches of old wounds, his spine was straight. When the final note faded, he raised his hand in one crisp motion and saluted George Whittaker. After the service, Jack returned to room 214. It had already been cleaned out. Beds stripped, photos removed, drawers empty. But the sunlight still poured through the window as if George had never left his chair. On the nightstand sat a plain white envelope addressed to Jack Monroe. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in shaky handwriting. Jack, if you're reading this, then I've gone where most old soldiers go, finally off the clock. I don't believe in much anymore, but I believe you showed up at exactly the right time. You gave me something better than medicine, a witness. You listened. You saw me. You didn't treat me like a relic. You treated me like a man. Thank you for sending the letter. Even if it arrived too late, it found its way. That's all we really want in the end. For someone to know we were here, that we mattered. Finish your 100 days. Tell your stories. Live wide and live loud. And when it gets too quiet, have a cup of Earl Grey and think of an old man who once blew up a tank with a lucky shot and a prayer. Yours, George Whittaker. Jack folded the letter slowly, pressing it to his chest. Felt like a weight and a blessing. That night, he walked to a nearby park and sat alone on a bench beneath an old elm tree. The city buzzed faintly in the background. Cars, distant horns, a barking dog, but none of it reached him. He took out a thermos and poured himself a cup of tea. Earl Grey. Steam rose into the night air. He lifted the cup in a quiet toast. To George, he whispered, and to all the ones who made it back, even if they didn't feel like it. The wind stirred the leaves gently. He sat there for a long time, sipping slowly, the warmth running down his throat and settling deep in his chest. And for the first time in years, Jack didn't feel alone. The following morning, Jack stood outside Willow Pines one last time, staring up at the old brick building where something inside him had quietly shifted. He'd arrived here just days ago to try a job, part of a strange promise to himself. But he was leaving with more than hours on a timesheet. He was leaving with someone's story, and perhaps a bit more clarity on his own. Inside the facility, he handed in his visitor badge. The receptionist smiled softly, sensing the end of something. "Thanks for what you did for Mr. Whittaker," she said. "He was different the last few days. Lighter." Jack gave a small nod. "I was just there to listen." Back in his apartment, Jack packed up his notebook, the one he'd started on day one to track the journey. Most of it was still blank. Just job titles, dates, a few scribbled notes. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Day 3, caregiver, Willow Pines. Not all wars are fought on battlefields. Some are fought in memory. Today, I witnessed a soldier pass on his last mission with honor and peace. He gave me a story. I gave him silence. It was enough. Let none of us be forgotten." He closed the notebook and leaned back. His body still ached, his knee especially. But something else inside him felt lighter, as if a door had opened and let in fresh air. For so long, Jack had felt like he was drifting, living out of bags, changing cities, avoiding connections. He thought this 100-day challenge might distract him long enough to keep the noise away. Instead, it was teaching him how to face the quiet head-on. That afternoon, he made one more stop before moving on to the next job. At a local Army-Navy store, he had George's name engraved on a simple brass plate. Then he took a short drive to a veterans cemetery on the edge of town, the kind of place most people pass by without ever looking in. He walked slowly, carefully, until he found a quiet corner beneath a pine tree and placed the small brass plate between two white headstones. He didn't say much, just a few whispered words. "George, I hope you found her, or at least found peace." He stood there a while, hands in pockets, the wind tugging at his jacket. Then he turned and walked back to the car. Day 4 would begin tomorrow. A new job, a new face, a new truth to learn. That night, he posted something on his small, growing blog. He hadn't planned to write publicly about the challenge, but something told him George's story deserved to be heard. Title: The Letter That Waited 78 Years. He was 92, a war hero, a man of silence. I was just supposed to help him eat lunch and walk the halls. Instead, he handed me a love story folded into an envelope sealed before I was born. This job wasn't about caregiving. It was about remembering. Not every old man in a wheelchair is fading. Some are burning quietly, waiting for someone to see the smoke. I saw him. He saw me. We said nothing for hours. And that silence told me more about war, loss, and life than any speech ever could. Thank you, George Whittaker, for your service, for your story, and for your trust. Day 3 changed me. I hope it reaches someone else out there who needs to hear it. He hit publish and sat back. He didn't expect many views, maybe a few fellow vets, maybe a stranger or two. But that didn't matter. The story had been told. The next morning he rose early. He packed his bag, lighter now than before, and scribbled a new line in his notebook. Day for freight handler. Warehouse shift. 6 a.m. He took one last look at the letter George had left him, folded neatly in the front pocket of his pack. Then he locked the door behind him and stepped outside. The sun hadn't fully risen yet. The sky was still blue-gray, the city still half asleep. But Jack was already moving. One day, one job, one story at a time. Forward march.